The champagne glass was still in her hand when she said it, loud enough for the 3 tables closest to us to go quiet. "He doesn't work exactly," Renata told her boss, laughing the way people laugh when they want a joke to land as charming instead of cruel. "He putters, watches the market, calls it consulting." Her boss, a silver-haired managing director named Foster Wexley, smiled the polite smile of a man deciding whether to be amused or embarrassed on my behalf. And in that half-second of his hesitation, I understood exactly how my wife had been describing me to people for longer than I wanted to know. I had flown in from Zurich 11 hours earlier, jet-lagged and quietly proud, holding a folder I planned to give her privately after the gala ended. The signed paperwork finalizing the firm's controlling stake in the very hospitality group hosting that night's event. The deal I'd spent 4 months structuring under a holding entity that carried my mother's maiden name instead of my own. I had no idea, walking through those gilded doors behind her in a rented tuxedo she'd picked out because she said my usual suits read as trying too hard for a man in my position, that I was about to watch my own wife perform my irrelevance for an audience of 200 people, 3 tables away from a man who would recognize my signature the moment he saw the deed. This is the story of the night Renata Calloway decided I was worth mocking to impress the man who signed her paycheck, and the 12 minutes it took for her to learn exactly whose paycheck that actually was. I should explain, before anything else, how a man ends up invisible inside his own marriage. It rarely happens the way people imagine, with some single dramatic betrayal you can point to and say, "There, that's where it broke." It happens in inches. It happens across a decade of small concessions that each seemed reasonable on their own, until one day you look up and realize the shape of your life has been quietly redrawn by somebody else's hand. My name is Desmond Okafor, and I met Renata Calloway 9 years ago at a fundraising dinner for a children's literacy charity, back when I was 31 and still working under my own name at a boutique investment firm in Chicago before I sold my stake and started building something considerably quieter and considerably larger on my own. Renata was 28 then, sharp-witted, ambitious in the specific, focused way of someone who had grown up watching her own parents struggle financially and had decided early that she would never let herself be caught in that position again. I found her drive magnetic. I still believe, even now, that some part of that admiration was genuine on both sides, at least in the beginning. We married 18 months later, and for the first several years, the marriage functioned the way healthy marriages function. 2 people building something adjacent to each other, cheering each other's wins, absorbing each other's disappointments. Renata worked her way up through corporate hospitality management, eventually landing a senior director role at Halcyon Meridian Group, a large hotel and events conglomerate with properties across 4 continents. I, meanwhile, had quietly stepped back from public-facing finance work entirely, restructuring my holdings under a private investment vehicle called Ashgrove Capital Partners, named for the street I grew up on rather than for myself, deliberately unlinked from my own name in any searchable public record. I had no idea, in those early years of building Ashgrove's portfolio in careful, unglamorous obscurity, exactly how much that quiet anonymity would eventually cost me a home. The shift in Renata began, as these shifts often do, with a promotion. 3 years into her tenure at Halcyon Meridian, she was elevated to vice president of corporate events under the direct supervision of Foster Wexley, the company's managing director for North American operations, a man whose approval, I gradually understood, had become the single most important metric by which Renata measured her own worth. Foster was polished in a particular way of men who have spent decades in rooms where appearances function as currency, quick with a compliment, quicker with subtle correction, the kind of boss who made people feel simultaneously flattered and perpetually on trial. Renata began adjusting herself around Foster's presumed opinions with an intensity that, looking back, I should have recognized as a warning sign considerably earlier than I did. She stopped mentioning my work at dinner parties unless directly asked, and even then, she'd offer some vague, deflecting phrase, "My husband does something in finance," delivered with a small, apologetic shrug that suggested the details were too boring, or perhaps too embarrassing to elaborate on. She began commenting on my wardrobe, my car, the modest brownstone we bought together 5 years earlier that I genuinely loved, and she started referring to as cozy in a tone that made the words sound like an accusation. "Foster asked what you do," she told me one evening, About 2 years before the gala, setting down her wine glass with precision that told me she'd been rehearsing how to bring this up. I didn't really know what to say. You could have told him the truth, I said. I manage a private investment portfolio. That sounds like nothing, Desmond. That sounds like you sit at home reading stock tickers. She wasn't entirely wrong about how it sounded, though she had no idea how wrong she was about what it actually meant. I had structured Ashgrove specifically so that its scope would never be obvious from a casual glance, holdings spread across real estate, private equity positions in mid-market companies, and, as of that particular season, a controlling interest in 3 separate hospitality groups I've been quietly acquiring over the preceding 18 months, including, though Renata never knew this, an 11% stake purchased 2 years earlier and expanded to a full controlling position 4 months. Before that, Gala, in Halcyon Meridian Group itself. I had no idea, sitting across from her that evening absorbing her quiet embarrassment about a life she genuinely believed was small, that the acquisition I was finalizing at that exact moment would eventually place me in a position to watch her humiliate me from a front row seat inside a company I owned. The reasons I kept my business dealings compartmentalized from our social life were, in the beginning, entirely practical rather than secretive. I had watched too many colleagues over the years get swarmed by opportunists the moment their net worth became common knowledge at dinner parties, watched marriages and friendships curdle under specific pressure that visible wealth applies to every relationship around it. I wanted, however naively, to be loved and respected for who I actually was in a room, not for a number attached to my name. I told myself for years that keeping Ashgrove quiet was a form of protecting our marriage from exactly the kind of transactional distortion that ruins so many relationships built around money. What I hadn't accounted for, and what I understood only much later, was that the quiet could work in the opposite direction too. Without the visible markers of success that Renata's world ran on, the wardrobe, the car, the job title people recognized at parties, she had slowly filled in the blank space where my accomplishments should have been with a story of her own making, one in which I was pleasant but unambitious, comfortable but unremarkable, a man who had, in her private accounting, simply stopped trying somewhere along the way. I had no idea how completely that private accounting had come to define how she spoke about me to other people until the night of the gala made it unmistakably, publicly clear. The Halcyon Meridian Annual Leadership Gala was, by design, the single most important social event of Renata's professional calendar, an evening where senior leadership, major clients, and the company's most valuable corporate partners gathered under one roof, ostensibly to celebrate the year's achievements, but functionally to perform status in front of each other with a precision that would have exhausted anyone who wasn't fluent in the specific language of corporate hierarchy. Renata had spent nearly 6 weeks preparing for it that year, not merely selecting her own gown, but curating, with visible anxiety, exactly how our table would present to Foster Wexley and the small cluster of senior executives seated near us. "I need you to understand how important tonight is," she told me 4 days before the event, laying my rented tuxedo across the bed like an offering. "Foster's deciding on the senior vice president role in the spring. This is essentially a 6-hour interview, and I need everything, including you, to read the right way." I remember the specific sting of that phrase, including you, the casual way she folded me into a list of variables to be managed rather than a person walking beside her. I said nothing at the time. I had, by then, become considerably too accustomed to absorbing these small cuts in silence, telling myself that the underlying marriage was still worth preserving, that this was simply Renata under professional pressure, rather than Renata revealing something durable about how she'd come to see me. I had no idea, agreeing quietly to wear whatever she'd selected and say as little as possible about my actual work that night, that I was about to walk into the one room in the country where my silence would end up costing me the most and revealing the most, all in the same evening. We arrived at the Halcyon Meridian Grand Ballroom in downtown Chicago a little after 7, Renata radiant in a deep emerald gown, moving through the entrance with the specific, practiced confidence of someone entering a stage she'd spent years rehearsing for. I followed a half-step behind, carrying, tucked discreetly inside my jacket, the folder I brought from Zurich, the finalized documents confirming Ashgrove Capital's completed acquisition of controlling interest in Halcyon Meridian Group, papers I'd intended to share with Renata privately once the evening had wound down, a quiet, personal celebration of a deal I was genuinely proud of, one that would, among other things, secure a position at the company for years to come, whether she ever fully understood why. I had no idea, walking through those doors with that folder pressed against my ribs, that I was about to spend the next several hours watching my wife dismantle, piece by piece, the version of respect I'd assumed still existed between us. The early part of the evening passed in particular, exhausting rhythm of corporate galas, cocktail hour small talk, a rotating cast of Renata's colleagues offering polite, cursory questions about my work that Renata answered before I could, deflecting with practiced ease toward some vague description that made my life sound smaller with every retelling. By the time we were seated for dinner at a table position, not coincidentally, 3 seats from Foster Wexley himself, I had absorbed enough of these small dismissals that I retreated into a careful, watchful quiet. The specific silence of a man deciding how much longer he was willing to keep swallowing something that was clearly building toward an unpleasant conclusion. It was during the main course, somewhere between the second and third glass of wine Renata had allowed herself, that Foster leaned across the table with the particular, performative warmth of a man about to deliver a compliment designed primarily to make himself look generous. "Renata, this venue transformation this year is extraordinary. You've outdone yourself." Renata beamed, the specific, brittle brightness of someone whose entire evening's success hinged on this exact reaction. It was a team effort, of course, but I'm thrilled you noticed the details. "And Desmond," Foster said, turning toward me with the polite obligation of a man remembering to include the spouse, "Renata tells me you're in finance as well. Are you still with your old firm?" It was, in retrospect, a perfectly reasonable question, the kind any decent host asks a colleague spouse at any ordinary function. What followed was not a reasonable answer. "Oh, Desmond doesn't really do that anymore," Renata said quickly. Before I'd even opened my mouth, her tone light, amused, the specific lightness people use when they want cruelty to sound like affection. "He doesn't work, exactly. He putters, watches the market, calls it consulting." She laughed and gestured toward me with her wine glass in a way that made me feel, for one long, suspended second, like an exhibit rather than a husband. "It's very sweet, honestly. Some men need a project. Desmond has spreadsheets." The table laughed. Not everyone, not cruelly exactly, but enough people in the reflexive, uncomfortable way that people laugh when someone senior in a room has clearly given them permission to. Foster's smile carried that same half-second of calculation I'd noticed in him all evening, deciding how to receive the joke, and he settled, predictably, into polite amusement, the safest possible response to a joke made at the expense of someone with no visible power in the room. I had no idea, sitting in that specific silence that followed, exactly how much restraint it would take not to reach into my jacket and end the entire performance in that instant. I chose, instead, to wait. "That's not quite accurate," I said, my voice even, careful not to carry the sharpness building underneath it. "I manage a private capital portfolio. It's fairly involved work." "Involved," Renata repeated. With a small, indulgent smile that made the word sound like a kindness she was extending to spare my feelings. "Sure, honey." Foster, sensing perhaps that the moment had grown slightly more awkward than intended, offered a diplomatic pivot. "Well, everyone finds their own rhythm. Not all of us need to be climbing constantly." It was meant, I think, as a small mercy toward me, and it landed instead as one more confirmation, in front of the entire table, that I was understood by everyone present as a man who had simply stopped trying. I had no idea, absorbing that particular mercy with a tight, controlled nod, that the folder in my jacket pocket contained the exact documentation that would, within the hour, make every single person at that table reconsider precisely how much I had, in fact, been climbing. The evening's formal program began shortly after dessert service, the lights dimming as Halcyon Meridian's chief executive officer, a composed, silver-templed man named Bartholomew Reyes, stepped onto the stage to deliver the year's opening remarks, thanking the assembled leadership for another strong year of growth, acknowledging several senior executives by name, including, with visible warmth, Foster Wexley's steady leadership of the North American division. I watched Renata sit up slightly straighter at the mention of Foster's name, watched her track his reaction with the specific, anxious attentiveness of someone gauging exactly how her own future might be shaped by his continued goodwill. I had no idea, watching that particular exchange, exactly how completely the entire architecture of her professional confidence had come to depend on a company whose ownership had, for months earlier, transferred entirely into my hands. It was during the transition between Bartholomew's remarks and the evening's awards presentation that I finally excused myself from the table. Stepping toward the hallway outside the ballroom to take a call I'd been expecting from my chief operating officer, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya Anand, who oversaw Ashgrove's day-to-day operations and who had, as it happened, arranged to be present at that evening's gala herself, in her official capacity as the newly appointed board liaison, overseeing Ashgrove's transition period with Halcyon Meridian's existing leadership. "You're here?" I asked, genuinely surprised, once I'd stepped far enough from the ballroom doors to speak freely. "I've been here since 6, Priya said, her voice carrying particular, dry amusement she reserved for moments she found quietly entertaining. "Bartholomew asked me to attend as the acquiring entity's representative before the formal announcement goes out to staff next week. I assumed you knew." I had, in fact, known, though I'd forgotten in the general exhaustion of the evening that Priya's presence meant the acquisition itself was considerably closer to public knowledge inside the company than I'd fully registered. "Has Bartholomew told the senior leadership team yet? Foster specifically?" "Not formally," Priya said. "The board approved the final documentation Tuesday. Bartholomew's planning to make the announcement to senior leadership Monday morning, ahead of the company-wide memo later next week." "Why?" I told her briefly what happened at the table, the specific shape of Renata's joke, the particular quality of the table's laughter, Foster's polite, diminishing kindness. Priya was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "Desmond," she finally said, "do you want me to say something to Bartholomew? He could move the announcement up if you wanted the timing to land differently tonight." I had no idea, standing in that quiet hallway with my wife's laughter still echoing faintly behind me from the ballroom, exactly how much I wanted, in that specific moment, for the timing to land differently. "No," I said after a long pause. "Not yet. Let me think about how I want this to go." I hung up and stood alone in that hallway for several minutes longer than I needed to, turning the folder over my hands, feeling particular, heavy stillness of a decision beginning to settle into shape. I returned to the ballroom just as the evening's award segment concluded and the room shifted into its open networking portion. Waitstaff circulating with fresh drinks, the orchestra beginning a slow, unobtrusive set as guests rose from their tables to mingle. Renata found me near the edge of the dance floor, her expression carrying particular, glowing satisfaction of someone who believed the evening had gone precisely as planned. "Foster loved the venue," she said, slipping her arm through mine with an easy affection that felt, in that moment, almost disorienting given what had preceded it. "I think the SVP role is basically mine. You seem very focused on impressing him tonight," I said carefully. "It's important, Desmond." She squeezed my arm, not unkindly, in the specific way people do when they genuinely don't understand they've done anything requiring an apology. "I know the joke earlier was a little much. I'll make it up to you. But you understand how these things work. Foster respects people who project a certain image, and I needed tonight to go smoothly. And I was part of the image that needed managing," I said. She hesitated, just briefly, something flickering across her face that might have been the beginning of genuine self-awareness before it settled back into practiced reassurance. "That's not fair. You know I love you. This is just work, Desmond. It doesn't mean anything about us." I had no idea, standing there absorbing that particular reassurance, exactly how thoroughly the next 15 minutes were about to demonstrate precisely how much it did, in fact, mean. It was Bartholomew Reyes himself who inadvertently set the final sequence in motion, crossing the ballroom floor with Priya Anand to step behind him, both moving with the specific, purposeful energy of people who had just concluded a private conversation and arrived at a decision. Bartholomew spotted me first, his face breaking into the warm, genuine smile of a man greeting someone he considered both a business partner and, over preceding months of negotiation, something approaching a friend. "Desmond," he said, extending his hand as he approached our small cluster near the dance floor, "I'm glad you made it tonight. I know you weren't planning to attend originally. I felt, rather than saw, Renata go very still beside me. Change of plans, I said, shaking his hand. Renata's company event, as it happens. Bartholomew's eyebrows lifted slightly. The particular expression of a man realizing in real time an overlap he hadn't previously connected. Wait, Renata Calloway is your wife. He turned toward her with dawning, delighted recognition. Renata, I had no idea. You've done remarkable work with this year's event. Truly. I'll admit I didn't put together that you were married to Desmond until just now. Renata's smile had gone thin and uncertain. The particular smile of someone sensing a conversation, moving somewhere she couldn't yet fully map. I'm sorry. I don't think we've actually met before tonight. Bartholomew Reyes, he said, still smiling, still entirely unaware of the specific weight his next sentence was about to carry. CEO here at Halcyon Meridian. Though I suspect, given the timing, I should let your husband explain the rest, since a formal announcement isn't scheduled until Monday. He turned back to me with an easy, conspiratorial warmth. Though given the circumstances, I don't see much reason to keep it quiet tonight, if you'd rather tell her yourself. I had no idea, in that specific, suspended half-second, exactly how completely the ground was about to shift beneath every assumption Renata had built her evening, and considerably more than her evening on top of. Foster Wexley had drifted closer during this exchange, drawn by the particular gravitational pull that senior executives develop toward any conversation involving their own CEO, and I watched, with a clarity I would remember in precise detail for years afterward, the exact moment understanding began arriving on his face as well. Renata, I said, reaching into my jacket and withdrawing the folder I'd carried through 11 hours of travel. I was planning to tell you privately tonight, after the gala. I wanted this to be something we celebrated together, quietly at home. I opened the folder and held it out, not dramatically, simply offered, the way you'd hand someone something true. 4 months ago, Ashgrove Capital Partners completed the acquisition of a controlling interest in Halcyon Meridian Group. I'm the majority owner of the company you work for, Renata. I have been for 4 months. The silence that followed was a specific, total silence of a room's worth of assumptions collapsing at once, though in truth it was only the small cluster immediately around us, Bartholomew watching with quiet, careful interest, Priya standing slightly behind him with the composed neutrality of someone who had known this moment was coming and had simply been waiting to see how it landed, Foster Wexley's face draining of the polite, diminishing warmth he'd carried toward me all evening and replacing it with something considerably closer to alarm. Renata stared at the folder, then at me, then at Bartholomew, as though waiting for one of us to reveal this as an elaborate joke constructed for reasons she couldn't yet fathom. That's not, Desmond, that's not possible. You manage a portfolio. You do consulting. I structured Ashgrove specifically so my name wouldn't be attached to it publicly. I said, keeping my voice level, deliberately free of the triumph I could feel humming underneath every word. That was my choice, and I understand now it was a choice with consequences I didn't fully anticipate. But everything I told you over the years about the work I do was true. You simply decided, without asking very many questions, that it must not amount to much. You let me tell people you putter, Renata said, her voice climbing towards something between disbelief and a dawning, horrified embarrassment. You let me say that in front of Foster. I let you say a great many things in front of a great many people. I said quietly, I've been letting you say them for years. Renata, tonight was simply the first time the room actually knew enough to understand exactly how wrong you were. Foster Wexley, who had been standing in increasingly uncomfortable silence throughout this exchange, cleared his throat with a particular, strained formality of a man recalculating his entire relationship to everyone present. Mr. Okaforhale, I had no idea. I hope the comment earlier about climbing didn't come across as... It's fine, Foster, I said and meant it, mostly, understanding that a particular offense had been considerably smaller than my wife's. A polite man extending an unnecessary kindness to someone he'd been led to believe needed it. You were responding to the information you've been given. I'm more interested in who gave it to you and why. I turned back to Renata, who was still staring at the folder in my hands, as though it might yet resolve into something less devastating than what it plainly was. "I want to be clear about something," I said, my voice carrying just far enough that the small circle around us could hear it without my needing to raise it further. "I didn't do this to humiliate you tonight, Renata. I genuinely came here planning to tell you privately, to celebrate something I'm proud of, quietly, the way I've celebrated most things in our marriage. You did the humiliating part on your own, in front of your boss, 3 hours before I even opened this folder. I simply happened to be standing here when the truth finally caught up to the story you've been telling about me. I had no idea." Watching her face move through several rapid, overlapping emotions, shock, then some that looked almost like relief before curdling immediately into a far more complicated, uglier recognition. Exactly how much longer this conversation was about to continue, or how many more people would eventually gather at its edges before it concluded. Bartholomew, sensing the moment had grown considerably more personal than a business introduction warranted, offered a diplomatic retreat. "I'll let you two speak privately. Desmond, we'll finalize the transition details Monday as planned." He nodded toward Priya, and the two of them withdrew a respectful distance, though not so far that I didn't notice Priya, glancing back once, her expression carrying the specific, quiet satisfaction of someone who had watched a long, slow-building situation finally, fully resolve. Foster, considerably less composed than Bartholomew, offered a stammering excuse about checking on the caterers and departed with the particular haste of a man eager to be anywhere else, leaving Renata and me standing alone at the edge of the dance floor, the orchestra continuing its unbothered, ambient set behind us, entirely indifferent to the specific unraveling happening a few feet away. "You could have told me," Renata said, once the immediate circle had dispersed, her voice dropping into something quieter, angrier, considerably less performative than anything she'd said all evening. "Years ago, you could have told me what you actually had, and none of this would have happened." "None of what would have happened, exactly?" I asked. "The specific version of respect you were withholding from me because you thought I didn't have enough money to deserve it?" "Renata, I need you to actually hear what you just said. You're upset that I didn't disclose my net worth sooner. Not that you spent years quietly humiliating a man you believed had nothing. Those are two very different problems, and only one of them is mine." She had no immediate answer for that. I watched her search for one anyway, the particular, familiar reflex of someone accustomed to talking her way through difficult moments, and watched it fail her for what I suspected was one of the first times in longer than either of us could easily measure. "I loved you before I knew any of this," she finally said. "That has to count for something." "It might," I said, and I meant it honestly, not as a concession but as a genuine, complicated acknowledgement of something I hadn't yet finished untangling myself. "But I don't think you loved the actual person standing in front of you for a long time now. Renata, I think you loved the story about who I might eventually become, and when that story stopped matching your ambitions quickly enough, you started telling a different one instead, a smaller one that let you feel superior at dinner parties. That's not the same thing as loving me, and I don't think either of us can pretend it is, not after tonight." I had no idea, walking away from her at the edge of that dance floor and returning briefly to find my coat, exactly how much the following months would end up costing both of us, or how completely the shape of my life would continue shifting in the wake of that single, quiet confession delivered inside a ballroom I happen to own. The weeks following the gala unfolded with the particular, grinding momentum of a marriage discovering, in real time, exactly how little was actually left to salvage. Renata attempted, in the days immediately after, a series of increasingly earnest efforts to repair what had cracked open that evening, apologies that grew more specific and more genuinely reflective each time, an acknowledgement, eventually, that she'd spent years measuring my worth by a standard she'd absorbed from a childhood defined by financial precarity, one where visible success functioned as the only reliable proof that a person mattered. I believed her, mostly. I think that specific insight was true, and I think, given enough time and enough hard, honest work, it might even have become the foundation of something worth rebuilding. But belief in the accuracy of an insight and willingness to continue rebuilding a marriage around it are two considerably different things, and I found, in the weeks that followed, that I simply didn't have the second one left in me, not after watching, with such total clarity, exactly how she'd chosen to treat the version of me she believed had nothing to offer. I don't think this is about forgiveness. I told her, during the last real conversation we had before I moved out of brownstone we'd shared for 6 years, the modest, cozy home she'd once described in a tone that made the words sound like an accusation. I think I actually do forgive you, Renata, or I'm getting there. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as deciding to keep building a life with someone who needed a folder full of legal documents to finally see me as worth respecting. I don't think I can unsee that about you now, no matter how sorry you are. The divorce proceedings that followed were, by mutual and somewhat surprising agreement, considerably less contentious than either of us might have predicted given the circumstances of our final unraveling. I had no interest in using Ashgrove's resources to punish her financially, understanding, even in my anger, that doing so would only prove the exact point she'd need years to fully absorb, that my worth as a person had never actually been about the size of my portfolio, and using that portfolio as a weapon now would undercut the entire truth I tried to articulate to her that night at the gala. Renata, for her part, retained her position at Halcyon Meridian, a decision I made deliberately, informing Bartholomew and the board that her employment should be evaluated entirely on the merits of her professional performance, unaffected by any personal history between us, a distinction I insisted on maintaining precisely because I refused to become, in my own private accounting, the same kind of person who let power distort every relationship it touched. She was, notably, never promoted to the senior vice president role she spent that entire gala evening angling for. Not because of any interference on my part, but because, as I learned considerably later through Priya's careful, professional updates, Foster Wexley himself had grown quietly, permanently uncomfortable around Renata following that evening, unable to fully separate his working relationship with her from the specific, unflattering light it had all been cast in once the truth about my holdings became common knowledge throughout the company. Whatever confidence he'd once had in her judgment had been undercut by watching, in real time, exactly how badly she'd misjudged something as fundamental as her own husband's character and circumstances. I found, to my own quiet surprise, very little satisfaction in that particular outcome. I had wanted, that night at the gala, some measure of vindication, some proof that the years of quiet dismissal hadn't simply disappeared into the ordinary erosion of a difficult marriage. But watching the actual consequences unfold, Renata's stalled career, her increasingly isolated position, within a company now indirectly connected to the husband she'd spent years describing as unremarkable, I discovered that vindication, once it actually arrives, carries considerably less warmth than the anticipation of it ever promised. What I found instead, in the month that followed, was something closer to clarity. I formalized Ashgrove's public presence for the first time in over a decade, stepping into a considerably more visible role within the industry, not out of any renewed desire for recognition, but because I understood, finally and fully, exactly what my years of careful anonymity had actually cost me. I had built that quiet, unattributed structure, believing it would protect me from being loved for the wrong reasons. What it had actually done, I came to understand, was leave me vulnerable to being unloved for reasons that were, in their own way, just as wrong, judged and diminished by someone who had decided, in the absence of visible proof, that I simply wasn't worth taking seriously. I began, gradually, dating again nearly a year after the divorce finalized, and found myself more than once testing new relationships with specific, deliberate honesty I'd never quite practiced with Renata, disclosing early and plainly exactly what I did, what I owned, what my actual life looked like beneath the quiet surface I'd once referred to present. I watched, with a kind of careful, clinical attention, how each new person responded to that information, understanding that the response itself would tell me considerably more about their character than almost anything else they might say. It was nearly 18 months after the gala that I met Adiz, a structural engineer with her own quietly successful consulting practice, at a fundraising event not unlike the one where I'd originally met Renata years earlier, though the resemblance ended almost immediately at the surface. Adiz asked, within our first real conversation, precise and genuinely curious questions about my work, not performing interest for the sake of politeness, but actually wanting to understand the shape of what I'd built. When I eventually told her, several months into dating, the full scope of Ashgrove's holdings, She absorbed the information with a kind of unbothered, practical curiosity that felt, after everything, almost startling in its simplicity. "That's interesting," she said, "but it doesn't really change anything about tonight's dinner reservation. You're still the person who forgot to defrost the chicken this morning." It was such a small, unremarkable response, and it meant, in that moment, considerably more to me than any grand romantic gesture could have. I think often, still, about that specific 12 minutes at the gala, the particular arc of it, Renata's careless, performative cruelty, the slow, dawning shift as Bartholomew's warm, unknowing introduction cracked the entire foundation of what she believed be true, the quiet, devastating clarity of watching someone finally understand exactly what they'd been dismissing all along. I don't think of it now as a moment of triumph. Not really. I think of it, instead, as a moment I finally understood something about my own choices, that the quiet I had built around myself, meant as protection, had also become a kind of hiding, and that hiding, however well-intentioned, leaves the people around you free to fill the silence with whatever story serves them best. I no longer build my life around that kind of quiet. Not because visibility protects a person from ever being underestimated again. I've learned it doesn't, not entirely. But because I understand now that the people worth keeping close are the ones who would have treated the modest, unremarkable version of me exactly the same way they treat the version who happens to own the room they're standing in. That, I've come to believe, is the only measure of respect actually worth trusting. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. And let me know in the comments, do you think Desmond was right to reveal the truth publicly in the moment, or should he have waited and told Renata privately as originally planned? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're telling the story of a nurse who spent a decade caring for a patient everyone else had given up on, and the letter she found in his desk after he passed that changed the entire course of her life.